it's important to realize that, we might not be interested in politics, but we no longer can remain neutral. I don't think that we can remain on the fence, because this movement really is harmful to human persons on a natural level, unjust, unmerciful, and ultimately very supernaturally dangerous. I think this is fundamentally a spiritual battle. So I think Christians can no longer remain on the fence at this point.
Welcome to Indie Thinker with Reed Huberman. You're about to make the jump from the dishonest mainstream media into free and independent thought from key thought leaders on the subjects of culture, causes, politics, and faith.
Our guest today is Noelle Mering. She is a theologian, philosopher, and the author of a brand new book, Awake, Not Woke, A Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology. Her voice in the culture, and especially in the church, could not be more important as the progressive movement begins to slowly creep its way into our lives. Today we'll talk about what's really behind the renormalization of societal norms, cultural Marxism, the real reason cancel culture exists, and the invasion of the Christian church by progressive ideals. Today you'll get a Class A guest with a Class A education that will help you make a difference in the world. Before we jump into that, please do us a big favor. Please make sure to subscribe on our channel and to rate and share this content with others. It's a huge help to us and helps us continue to bring on great guests like Noelle. Well, let's go ahead and jump into the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Noelle Mering is a fellow at Washington, D.C.-based think tank, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where she co-directs the Theology at Home project. She is also the editor for Theology at Home and the co-author of the Theology at Home book series. And she is the author of the book that we'll be really interested in talking about today, Awake, Not Woke, A Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology. And that book was so amazing and so very informative that I was very honored that you said that you'd be willing to come on today. So we're going to dig mostly into that book. She also studied philosophy and theater at Westmont College in California and did graduate work at Franciscan University of Steubenville. So Noelle, thanks so much for being on today.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here, Reed.
Absolutely an honor of mine. I mean that sincerely. When I read your book, I thought to myself, boy, what a breath of fresh air to hear a Christian who is also very effective and very informed. And just quite frankly, after 18 years of ministry, I found some of that lacking. And I'm just so glad to hear your voice in the space that you're in, to just really be talking about culture, just because I think we need to do that. So we'll jump into the why, and perhaps maybe even do that a little bit here with this first question. But I'm just curious because I had a Christian education as well. I got my master's degree in 2012 from a Christian university. Did a bunch of study in theology and philosophy were kind of my mainstays. And I wanted to throw this in here too, because I don't want to miss this before I ask this question. So you studied theater. I'm just kind of curious as a side note about that. So why? So it's like philosophy and then theater. So why theater?
Yeah, both such very practical majors.
Right.
I just grew up in doing dance and theater. And so when I was picking a college, I thought, well, I'll just continue what I'd done all through high school. And I love theater. And I haven't done it since I graduated from college, but I love to go to theater. And I like that art form. I think it's really special and beautiful.
Yeah, I really think philosophy in some way is, I think it's an art, but I also think it's akin to the theater, because I think it's a way of trying to figure out how to communicate effectively to people. And I just think at the end of the day, I think story is the shortest distance between truth and the human heart. So philosophy at the end of the day, I think is an attempt at that too. So I'm curious about your studies though. Before we jump into your book, I just want to ask you this, because I think in some ways my education should have been a canary in the coal mine in terms of the fact that it's Christian education, it's religious education. And I saw many of the things that you write about in your book prevalent in my education, which I think, if I dug into that a little bit more, I'll save people that story, but I think if I dug into it a little bit more, people would be very surprised about it. So I'm interested if anything in your educational background kind of promoted or provoked the writing that you're doing today beyond just the material that you were studying, but maybe some of your experiences in the academy. Obviously, it's at the forefront of a lot of what we're talking about today, about just kind of the woke invasion of the academy, not to mention all of our institutions. And perhaps when that happens within Christian institutions, that's a time for us to just kind of let the alarm to sound off. But I'm curious, did you experience any of that in your education background, or was there kind of a prompting based upon your education that caused you to write Awake, Not Woke?
Yeah, during my time in college, I don't know if my antenna weren't too sensitive at the time or if it just wasn't as prevalent then as it is now. But actually, interestingly enough, the things that happened at my college after I graduated helped prompt me to write this. I started hearing more and more stories. I only live about half an hour from my college, and I still love the college. I had great experience there, and I think they still do a lot of good. But there are all these news stories coming out that the students were staging all sorts of woke revolts on campus about what relatively was a pretty benign issue. They're protesting. There's one old chapel on campus, and the president, who had been there in the 50s, 60s, the mid-century of the last century, his daughter had died tragically in a car accident. He dedicated this chapel to her and had this stained glass window commissioned. And it was a white, depiction of Jesus with, white skin and kind of light hair. And he was standing on top of North America, like on top of a globe, but happened to be standing on top of North America. So the students really found this someone started the idea that this was really offensive, and they wanted the school to replace it. And they wound up staging all sorts of protests with sticker or tape over their mouths saying resist. And they were protesting when donors were coming. And it just seemed, and maybe there's more to the story than I tried to read as many of the articles from both viewpoints as I could. But it just seemed to me that there was sort of a mimesis happening there, in the sense that these were kids who were seeing that there's an avenue towards virtue, which is protesting injustice, and to kind of gives them an incentive to look for injustice. How is there oppression here in my school? And I think that's a really perverse incentive. And I just seeing it happening there, and then hearing about it happening at more and more schools, and also seeing how some of my contemporaries in college were, just on social media, you see what people think and how they're processing things. And I just noticed that more and more I was seeing a real kind of militant Christian element that was becoming more and more woke. And I wanted to dig into that and try to understand what was happening and why they were being so pulled by this movement.
Yeah, that's great. And it's interesting. And I think it's very fair of you to say that there might have been some things that you missed, but quite frankly, that story sounds par for the course for what's happening in our society today. So I'm surprised that there wasn't any vandalism of that window. But yeah, so there's some things happening, and I wanted to start this way. I don't know if you're familiar with this story, but I've been kind of captivated in terms of what's going on in our culture right now. So I'll share this. This is from Soren Kierkegaard. He said, "A fire broke out backstage in a theater. The clown came out to warn the public. They thought it was a joke, and they applauded. He repeated it. The acclaim was even greater. I think that's just how the world will come to an end. To general applause from wits who believe it's a joke." Reason I think that that's interesting to me is not that we clap like seals into the apocalypse, but simply just because the way the news cycle moves, the way we're just becoming numb to the truth in society, I think it's hard for people to be moved. And maybe this is always the way we've been. We have to recognize a threat before we actually respond to it. And this is a silly analogy, probably the best way I can think to explain it is that in the complex where I live, people do not pick up their dog's poop. And I think that they have to step in it before some people have to step in it before they finally start saying, okay, I'm going to pick up after my dog. So we have to recognize the threat before the alarm goes off, before we start responding to it. And so this is why I really love your book. I think that it can help us connect the dots between what's happening in the culture and some of the ideologies that perhaps are behind some of these cultural phenomenons, and especially for Christians. As we start to identify those things, I think it should awaken us to the reality of our response and what we should be doing in the culture. So maybe just generally, why did you write the book? Because it's very different than Theology of Home in the series that you did there. Obviously, both still have connecting points and similarities, but obviously a very different book. So what was kind of the main catalyst for you writing your book, Awake, Not Woke?
Sure. No, it's a great question. I have a few answers. I think the first and most immediate motivator was that it seemed to me to be a movement that was harming the very people it was claiming to help. And that seemed like a real injustice, that by under the guise of being compassionate, it actually was, is a really merciless movement. But I also really, I have maybe it's a fault, and it can be a fault or a strength depending on the situation and how I channel it. But I have a hard time with ideas that mandates or cultural norms that don't make sense to me. And it seemed to me like the woke movement just time and again just didn't make sense. And there are also a lot of confusion surrounding it. So, for example, like after the George Floyd murder, there were a lot of Christian friends marching with BLM, and that their belief statement page got published, and it was people were saying, well, why does a movement for racial justice want to queer the culture and disrupt the nuclear family? What does that have to do with racial justice? And so I really wanted to understand, well, they're obviously connected, and it's probably not coincidence. So why are these things interrelated, and why are they integrated with each other? And that was interesting to me to dive into. But then ultimately, I think that I saw it as I started researching it more, and I was sort of my intuition already was that this was a movement that was really had an anti-gospel message. And ultimately, I think is kind of operates parasitically off of the waning residue of Christianity until it will replace it. I think at least, and the movements in the inner logic of the movement. I think that's
Can
what
I
it
stop you
strives.
right there and just ask you to unpack
Sure.
that, because I think that's a great statement that you just made, that it's parasitic and it leaches on to the remnants of Christianity within a culture. So can you pack that a little bit? What is it leeching onto in terms of the Christian remnants in the culture? What is that remnant that Christianity is leaving behind that it's attaching to?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think as Christianity wanes, then we have an increasing culture that doesn't have sort of the habits of life of a Christian life. The disciplines and the habits of virtue maybe
Yeah.
have become less emphasized, but there's still sort of these maybe sentimental understand or instincts towards it. So that's why I think we see Christ become in our imagination sort of just like this figure who doesn't demand anything of us, but just wants to encourage or make us feel good,
Yeah.
And comforted. And there is something to that, and there is obviously there's an order in which you don't want to go fire and brimstone with people who are wounded and need to hear the message of love. So there's an order in which we communicate who Christ is, but I mean ultimately like we have to know who he is in his fullness. And so in other words, so I think by operating or parasitically, what I mean is that a person, if we are a culture that is primed to not want to hear anything that demands something of us, but want to feel comforted, then a message that the woke movement provides is it takes the precept of you have to reach out in compassion. The Christian message is to be compassionate to people who are struggling on the margins. And that is a true Christian precept. Christians are supposed to walk with the marginalized and are supposed to walk with the suffering and oppressed. But then it takes that right precept and inserts all these other conclusions into it that are really from an ideology, not from Christianity. And that's how it becomes truly, a totalizing and reductive movement, because it takes one filter and it makes it the only filter through which you can see it. So the only way you can love people is by having this ideology, and the ideology basically is trying to love people through lies, right? And through the denial of stable human nature, and ultimately in denial of any type of moral law.
Yeah.
And so this is, fundamentally opposed to love. We know that truth and love are, they're not set against each other, but rather are, they are one in Christ and ultimately too. So, and the moral law flows directly from the nature of God. So we can't separate these things. And I don't think people flourish when we do either, even on a natural level. People want to understand that there is a way they can improve and a way that they can really be happy. And God has given us a path towards happiness, but it is a path that requires some discipline, and not always following our whims. So it's a big answer, but I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, because I've often thought, and maybe this is just another way of saying the same thing. I've often thought that many of the cultural movements of our day are relying upon a Christian idea of compassion. And so what's happened is that maybe another way to say is they're guilting people into accepting ideas. Like the reality is that nowadays we believe that many people believe that it's unloving to suggest that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, or that a man can have a cervix. If you don't accept that statement, well, then you're an unloving, bigoted human being, rather than the person that actually appreciates facts and appreciates telling the truth. And now, obviously, truth could be used as a battle axe to hit people over the head with, but sympathy and truth are not in competition with each other. And by the way, I use the word sympathy because I think we're overusing the word empathy in our culture, and I don't think we have as much empathy as we say we have access to. But anyway, the way I put this is that I think sympathy is that truth is way more powerful than sympathy. And I think that if we're not careful, we can allow sympathetic talking points from ideologues to lead us down a path that leads us further and further away from reality, certainly biblical truth. And I think it's a slippery slope that we have to be careful of. I think the church, by and large, and I know we come from different Christian circles. I come from the evangelical world, and I think you come from the Catholic world. Is that right?
Yeah, my undergraduate was evangelical. Half my family is evangelical, so I'm comfortable in both worlds, but I am Catholic. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I just think, at least from my world and perhaps from yours, I think that there's many pastors who are falling for the temptation to veer away from the truth and just to change the message so that they can be more quote unquote loving, forgetting that some of the most loving things that you can do is to tell the truth. Of course, the way you tell it is important, but to tell it nonetheless. So I think that's really, really important for people to recognize. So perhaps maybe the next thing that we can kind of jump into is, because I think that one of the things that we have to do is we have to help people understand what's going on. In chapter 4 of your book, you said this: what's happening in culture would seem all too bizarre and utterly confounding were we ignorant of the history and the goals of systemic Marxism. Now, I think that that's where so many people are living in this space right now, and even Christians are resisting Christian ideas, traditional Christianity and biblical truth. They're resisting it because of cultural talking points. And so many of us are living in this kind of confused space for, like, we don't understand why we're normalizing gender to have like 78 genders and climbing, right? I was on a podcast just the other day, and I said LGBTQIA+, and they were like, wait, where did those last IAs come from? I hadn't heard that's a thing now, but it just seems like that's an ever increasing thing, right? Where are these transgender story hour for our children? Where is that coming from? Where is even maybe something unfortunately banal as like defund the police? Where are these cultural things coming from? And people are just left, essentially, if they don't understand the underpinnings of these ideas, to maybe adopt a sympathetic view and say, which, BLM has done effectively, just like Black Lives Matter. And so if you don't agree with us, then obviously you're saying Black lives don't matter, right? And so we're threatened and extorted into following these cultural trends if we do not know where they come from. And this is what I find is the big thing that's lacking in the church, is that we do not know our history well. We do not know the underpinnings of these cultural phenomena. And if we did, we would understand the necessity for pushing back against them. So perhaps I'm going to approach this kind of in a weird way maybe, but perhaps if you can, and I know this is a big thing, but if you can condense it as much as possible, could you give us a timeline of the woke movement, starting with Marx, moving into Gramsci, moving into kind of the critical theory of of people like Horkheimer and stuff in Columbia, and then maybe even couch that too in terms of conflict theory and why that's important in terms of where we're at today.
Sure. So in the book, I go through an origin section which traces this history. And I started with Karl Marx, who actually really, by using him, I'm actually starting with Hegel. So Marx was a big devotee of the philosophy of a German philosopher named Hegel. And Hegel came up with what he called the dialectic. which really explains a lot of the woke movement today. And the dialectic was basically just that he understood that all social movements or all of society basically has some internal contradictions, where there's going to be some elements of society that are at odds with one another. So you'll start with the status quo, which you call the thesis. There'll be the internal elements that are contradictions. So for example, Marx took this structure and said, well, this is the ruling class and the working class. This is an internal contradiction, because it's not a coherent or harmonious society when you've got this sort of economic oppression. And so at some point, the working class revolts against the ruling class. This is called the antithesis. And then they come up with a synthesis, which is the combination of these, what had been and what now is. And then you start a new thesis, and then society just keeps going through these revolutions and with each revolution, you're getting closer to a utopian state, until ultimately Marx predicted we would be in, this communist utopia. Yeah. But it only can be achieved through a series of revolutions. And so he really identified the enemy of revolution as being two things: the church and the family. Why? Because Christianity, he rightly recognized, gives people a context for their suffering. It says, well, I don't have as much as the next guy, and I have hardships in my day, but I'm given a model of embracing my cross. I can take my sufferings, and they can be something that I can grow closer to Christ through. And I don't have to envy the other person. I don't have, this life is not all there is. There's another life. And so that kept people from being angry and revolting against their circumstances. Secondarily,
is this why Marx said that religion is the opium of the people?
Yeah. So the religion was considered to keep us out from having a correct consciousness. It gave us a false consciousness where we thought we could be satisfied with a fundamentally oppressive life. Yep. And the family, he said, really did the same, because family life gives you it is by definition sort of, there's a hierarchical structure to it. Children are, subordinate to their parents, in a healthy, well-ordered family, in a loving way, not in a dominating way. But there is there is a natural community there that really defies the power of an ideology. It protects you from ideology in a way, because it gives you a sense of belonging. It gives you a sense of your personhood. Things that are really the antithesis of what revolution wants from people. The revolution wants you to feel diminished. It wants you to feel angry. It wants you to feel depersonalized, right, until you are helpless and then enraged. Yeah. So this was this was a very small snapshot of his formulation of the world. And then after World War I, there were a group of German Marxists who were frustrated that the revolution had not come to pass. Marx had said it was inevitable, but the German proletariat had not risen up. And so they started this institute called what eventually became to be called the Frankfurt School. And the point of the institute was to analyze why the revolution had not occurred and how can we bring revolution to the West. They were welcome to be sort of adjacent to Columbia University in 1935. And the Frankfurt School is really made up of a group of German Marxists who were also had a strong neo-Freudian element to them. And this is really where you get critical theory. So the critical theory originated in the Frankfurt School, where they realized on the heels of Gramsci, who was an Italian communist, that the revolution could not be fought merely on the terms of economics, that we had to broaden it in order across broader classes of people and create different divisions throughout society. It cannot just be a class division. It should also be division based on race. It should be division based on gender, and eventually division based on sexuality, as we see now, and gender identification. So they really saw three ways of seeding revolution, particularly in America, but throughout the West. And the three ways were revolution through the sexual revolution, to break down all the sexual mores of the society. And this comes strongly from a neo-Freudian element, which we can talk about later, through the culture. So a couple of the Frankfurt School guys went to Hollywood and realized they were sort of sickened by it. They thought it seemed like such a cheap art compared to the art they experienced in Europe. But they really saw how much Americans were taken by celebrity and how powerful that was. And so they really seeded this idea that all movies should be about oppression narratives. And I think we really see that now, where almost every, Oscar winner is about some sort of oppression narrative, be it feminism, racism, homophobia, all these, all the hot button issues. And then also through the academy, so through the school system. So, and I think we see how effective that has been, decades later, that all of this work that they put in, they really understood that revolution has to go underground at this point. We have to be, it's not going to be a revolution that's fought in the streets, or at least not anytime soon. It's going to be a revolution that's seeded through changing the way people understand and view society, and getting people to see all of society and all of human interactions as struggles for power. That in every human interaction, someone's an oppressor and someone's an oppressed, and you have to identify that. And that's the goal of becoming a social justice warrior, finding that injustice and fighting against it. And it really creates a society. People are very suspicious and defensive and accusatory, and ultimately, I think, an extremely toxic society. But does that connect those dots?
100%. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that we're seeing now in terms of how those dots connect to the present. So how would you say cancel culture plays in to some of those ideas, and to like maybe even the ideas of resentment?
Yeah, I mean, well, cancel culture. So any ideology is, or totalitarian regime, in which the woke movement really mimics, or actually embodies in some ways, it's fundamentally based on a lie, right? The lie that their one filter is the only way to see the world, that every human dynamic is a power struggle. Simply not true.
Yeah.
There are human dynamics that are actually mutually giving, mutually loving. But all the other fundamental lie is that human nature can be fundamentally changed. And that's, what we've hinted about with the transgender movement. And the thing that, just as a sidebar, the thing that's fascinating to me about the transgender movement is that, it's an appeal to walk with these people who are on the fringe of society, and I think that people buy into it because they think, well, that's the loving thing and it doesn't really demand anything from me. I'm not going to become transgender by telling them that they're okay.
Right.
But the thing we're not realizing is that it's actually it's an ideological bomb throughout society. It's meant to destroy and dismantle and destabilize all of our understanding what it is to be a human being.
Yeah. And
once you disrupt that understanding, then you can continue with the ideological goal of reshaping human person, that human beings can be deconstructed and reconstructed according to the vision of the ideology. We saw this in Maoist China, Stalinist Russia, and we're seeing it with the woke movement now.
Yep.
That's a sidebar. But so with cancel culture, so because there are these fundamental lies seeded into the ideology, the greatest threat to a lie is that someone's saying the truth. And so the only way that a lie or an ideology can perpetuate itself is through coercion, force, and silencing, and shaming. And that's what we see in cancel culture, is that the truth is not, another side is not to be tolerated. And there have been essays that they've written about this very explicitly. Marcuse, who was a real celebrity at the Frankfurt School in the 60s, he wrote a famous pivotal essay called Repressive Tolerance, where he said, you cannot give equal side. We are not here to dialogue. We are not here to hear all sides. And any ear that you give to, the dominant point perspective, the traditional perspective, or, the person who believes in moral law, this is a perpetuation of their dominance. And so they have to be silenced. So cancel culture is really fundamental to the movement. It's not incidental. It's not that they're being hypocrites. They're actually living up to their ideology, which is, we don't want to dialogue. We want to dominate.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think sometimes we think it overwrought just because it's a word that's used a whole lot. But I think it's important for us not to move too quickly past those things. And one of the reasons I think it is because of a word that you just said, destabilization. So the way I understand the movement is destabilization comes before the next stage, which is renormalization. And so maybe there may be some unpacking to do here. So I'm just going to throw this out there and see if there's anything you want to comment on it. But one of the quotes that I've taken from Marx that has stuck with me the most is that, and I may paraphrase here a little bit, but it's essentially necessary for the Marxist revolution, for communism to exist, for the destabilization of all existing conditions, for the removal of all existing conditions. So Marx, in a lot of ways, is just a chaos theorist who wanted to throw everything in disarray because he thought that then people would devour themselves. There would be nothing but ashes left. And then from the ashes, we could create something totally new. And we see this a lot, I think, in the deconstruction movement in Christianity, or maybe just in the deconstruction deconstruction movement writ large. It's not that we're having dialogues about discussing about how we can do things better. It's that we are interested in tearing down the system entirely from the root system up, totally destroy it. There's no real discussion about what we're going to build in its place. All we're about is totally destroying stuff. And then once we destroy everything, we'll talk about what we're going to put in its place. And this is where the conservative inside of me just goes kind of nuts, because I'm thinking to myself, well, there's some things that, like the G.K. Chesterton quote, right? Where if you're going to take a fence down, ask why it was there in the first place. Before you start moving fence posts, figure out why that fence is there, or else you're going to realize the hard way that it was there for a reason. And so I'm just wondering, what can you speak to in terms of the way that we're seeing destabilization in society? Because I think that feeling that you call bizarre and utterly confounding is our response to destabilization. It's this unnerving, kind of unsettling, kind of maybe almost even gut instinct inside of us that something's not right here. I think that is, regardless of your political perspective, unless you're on the far left, I think that's something we can all relate to. I mean, we're living in an age, and I don't want to ramble on because maybe you've got some things to jump in with, but we're living in an age where I, as an evangelical Christian, find myself applauding Bill Maher all the time. And I'm thinking to myself, how in the world do we get to the place where, like, now me and Bill Maher have more in common than we do, not distinct from each other. So maybe what would you say in terms of helping my audience members understand the role of destabilization in society and the overthrowing of all existing conditions in the way that we're seeing that presently in our culture?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you explained it so well. I mean, I guess I would just point them to, what they're seeing now and what we've seen historically, right? So there are so many connections to what was happening in Mao's China with the pulling down of statues, burning of books, burning churches, getting rid of everything that was old or traditional. And that it is really because it's a movement based on destruction, as you said, that was truly, and it sounds, I think it's hard for people to believe because it really does sound so radical. And most normal people don't think like this. So, even my friends who are woke, I don't think they understand the full implications and the full logic of the movement. They just see it as a movement of goodwill and helping things and righting some old wrongs. But if you read the literature, it truly is not an exaggeration to say that they really, the point of critical theory is just to criticize everything that is. And fundamentally, it's a rejection of being itself, that it is an anti-being movement, which is traditionally what we would understand theologically as being evil. Evil is the lacking of being, right? Evil doesn't have its own being, it's a deprivation. And this is really what the movement is aiming to do. It destabilizes through destroying. And I think it leaves us really unmoored. So here's an example. And I wrote an article about when Dr. Seuss got canceled. And I understand that he was, he probably wasn't off this pillar of virtue. I mean, I don't really know that much or actually even care that much about Dr. Seuss. But what I was trying to point out to people is that no one really the people who sought out this agenda to destroy him or cancel him. Well, first, for one thing, they were avowed in critical theory, and I don't know for sure if they were avowed Marxists, but they were deeply into critical theory. And the goal of doing something like that, it's not really that anyone cares that much or that Dr. Seuss is doing harm or whatever. The idea is that let's take an icon, that is in some small way plays into a common cultural history or common narrative that we have. It could be anything. It could be baseball. It could be, Charles Dickens. It could be, American football or something. All of these things that they're even in benign ways have united us. And disrupt them and make them political to the point where we think, well, I grew up reading Dr. Seuss. What did I miss? What did I not see? What else don't I know? And I think the point is truly to both unmoor us from a common cultural back history, but also to make us not trust ourselves, to think, that there are all sorts of things. If he's racist, then anybody can be racist. And I don't know how to trust myself, so I have to trust the ideologues that are pushing this movement. I have to just side with the strong men who are saying, this is what's right, this is who's gone, this is who's okay, and no longer understand that I have any access to reality. And that to me is one of the most disruptive and destabilizing thing that we can do, is to think that we can no longer reason. We can no longer reason together, and we can no longer reason independently. We can't truly think things through. Yeah. And so we have to think through things shallowly. And that's what the movement wants, is shallow thinkers. That's why it operates on propaganda. Is because sloganeering is it's a death of thought. It's a way to kind of hang our hat on something as on a sentence that we think we've thought through. Really haven't. It's just a shorthand for thought, but it isn't real thought.
Yeah. I think that's why some people call what's happening on the left side of the political aisle now with so much of their sloganeering. I think that's why they're trying to create a kinship between a religion and what's happening on that side, because I don't like the kinship, quite frankly, but I understand where they're coming from in terms of saying that there's almost a liturgy behind like slogans like "My body, my choice." That there's just this kind of unthinking fealty towards the sloganeering that's happening on the left. So I definitely think we're seeing that from many different angles and many different places in our culture. But I want to ask you a question about that, because it's really important, because I've really wondered, where is this stuff coming from? What's the incubator for the kind of the cultural phenomenons we're seeing right now, whether it's cancel culture, the renormalization of gender, totally defying scientific fact, or maybe even and it's so difficult too, because in some ways there should be racial reckoning in America. There should be racial conversations that we're having, but I'm also a little bit disturbed that all of this comes on the heels of all these other things that are happening culturally. So maybe you throw that into the mix too. But what's the incubator for cultural Marxism, critical theory, and its infestation into so much of the institutions that we see in America? Where do you think those things are coming from? I have an idea, but I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on the origin of it. Like, where's it coming from presently so that it's proliferating the way that it is?
I mean, I think the greatest engine and conveyor belt for the movement has been the academy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's right. We've seen for years, and I think that with the safe spaces and the militancy that we've seen increasing on campuses, a lot of us have just dismissed it as saying, well, they're going to go on the real world and they're going to see that's not how the real world operates. But I'm not the first to say this. It's almost like the whole culture has become a campus, where that sort of militancy is really forceful. And I think the fact that it's so forceful is why it gains so much power. So you've seen, like, even in the New York Times, which is, a pretty left-wing rag, there's still an old guard that I think is more classically liberal instincts, open conversation and that type of thing. But in the what I've read about the internal conflicts, and Barry Weiss, who was liberal lesbian journalist, brilliant woman, she had to leave the New York Times because the militancy of the cancel culture was too intense and too appalling to her as a journalist and a fair-minded thinker. But I think that the old guard is really kowtowing to this new militant youth. And because they're so forceful, and the old guard doesn't want to, they want to feel still relevant, there's this dynamic that happens. But in some ways, I think it's just the air we breathe, right? So much of what we've been raised in, it's, I go through 3 dogmas, and the second dogma is basically expressive individualism, that my identity is what I desire. And very particularly, we identify with our sexual desires, and even more specifically, we identify with our sexual desires that are non-conforming to, traditional mores. But that sort of ideology is so pervasive throughout culture, even without being on the campus. I think that every movie you watch, almost most conversations you have, television shows you watch, we're all built around this idea, or breathing this idea of expressive individualism. It's very hard to escape. So I think it's incubated throughout all the institutions of society at this point. And that's why it's so hard to identify in some ways, and so hard to pull yourself out of, because it really is truly just all around us.
Yeah. And what do you think the collateral damage, because let's turn the conversation now to kind of the faith-based community, because this is where I've kind of spent my space. This is what I think Indie Thinker by and large is dedicated to, is kind of figuring out what our response is, not to be merely reactionary, but is there a Christian response to some of the things that we're seeing in society? And if so, what is that response? So what do you think the collateral damage of not responding is? Or what do you think the real need for Christians to respond to some of these cultural trends is?
Yeah, it's such a big conversation, and I think an important one, because, I think a lot of Christians, including myself at times over the years, has felt like well, even, I might be interested in politics, but I need to make sure that politics are not, getting in the way of sort of more mission oriented apostolate or evangelical instinct. To really get to know people and be true, authentically friends with them, and try to reflect Christ as best as I can possibly can, in order that they might see Him. But I do think that we are at a point where we can no longer be neutral. And I see a lot of churches kind of try to take this neutral stance. We don't get into political issues.
Right.
Well, historically, that's not been the church's role. The church actually has gotten into political issues when they are very deeply impacting human persons. So, for example, a lot of church leaders were walking with Martin Luther King Jr. and walking, against racism.
Yep.
Against segregation. And that no one would say now, like, oh, well, they shouldn't have gotten into politics. Of course they should have. They're shepherds, that's the role of the Christian, is to lead society in those ways that are exhorting the dignity of the human person against injustice. And so I think similarly now it's important to realize that, we might not be interested in politics, but we no longer can remain neutral. I don't think that we can remain on the fence, because this movement really is harmful to human persons on a natural level, unjust, unmerciful, and ultimately very supernaturally dangerous. I think this is fundamentally a spiritual battle. And so I think Christians can no longer remain on the fence at this point.
Yeah, and I'm just kind of curious. I hope this doesn't sound too pessimistic, because I promise I'm an optimist. I personally think, at least in the circles that I run in, I think we are so reactionary in Christianity. I run in kind of the more millennial pastor, seeker-sensitive movement, and the buzzword for those guys is relevant to the culture. Are we too late? Because we have the unfortunate habit of reacting to the culture in a knee-jerk way, far, way later than we should have. Are we too late to really stop the woke ideology that's infesting churches, and even some big pastors with notoriety? Are we too late to kind of stop that trend?
I'm an optimist too, so I would say definitely not. But I am also extremely bad at predicting the future, so I don't know what's going to happen. But I can't. I don't think that there's any reason to despair. There's always the possibility of turning things around and redemption and all these things. But I think that, it takes, because it really is, people are called in different circumstances in their lives to have a different sort of witness. I mean, obviously I'm so out there with my opinion as a writer that, my liberal friends now, they always kind of knew I was conservative, but now I think it's just like, oh, wow, you're really conservative.
Did you storm the Capitol on January 6th?
But I think I would just encourage Christians, and particularly pastors, that, this is an opportunity to really be a leader, and that it's so hard to pull ourselves out of the age in which we're in. But for a Christian, it really is imperative, because, there's another G.K. Chesterton quote that, we run the danger of being slaves to the age in which we're in. And that is a type of slavery, right? To not be able to think outside of the age we're in now. And the way that I think we can start to think outside of it is through reading the stories of other Christians who've come before us 100 years ago, 200 years ago, martyrs of the church. Obviously prayer, reading the Bible, reading about, trying to find the universal human experience and how people found courage in hard times, and how to speak the truth in love, but I don't, because the reason why it's so confusing, I think, is because there is such a strong message telling us to shut up, telling us that we should not speak about hard truths.
Yeah.
And that's simply a lie. And so, but that doesn't mean that we go around with wagging our finger and like pedantic scolds, right? That's an unbecoming posture for a Christian as well. So how we do that, get beyond those messages that are confusing us, but also do it with prudence and with the Holy Spirit operating through us, and not with our own desire to just kind of rage against the society. There's other extremes we can go to that are very problematic too.
Yeah. I think in the past, perhaps we've done that a little bit and maybe ruined some credibility. And I think that that's kind of what we're battling now too, is that, like, we don't want to have that Chicken Little syndrome of the sky is falling, but also too, like, I'll just put it this way. I think we would be better off being accused of speaking too much than not speaking enough. Like, we don't want history written about us to be anything like what is written about the German church in World War II, who stands by while atrocities are taking place. Now, obviously, that's a little bit hyperbolic, I suppose, given where we're at presently, because there's certainly an overwrought, kind of association to Nazism in society today. And I'm not meaning to say that, but I am meaning to say that we do need to speak. We do need to have a voice in the culture. Edmund Burke was right when he said the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. So I do think we need to have a response. And I want to ask you here if one of the things you wrote in your book is a really necessary response. Before I do that, I kind of have just a personal question I wanted to ask you, because of dovetailing on what we just talked about with kind of the infestation of the woke movement in institutions, in the academy, but also in the church, because I think that it's undeniable that this is happening, that we have pastors who are way less likely to speak about biblical sexuality. We have pastors who are way less likely to be pro-life. We have pastors who, and the list goes on and on and on. And so I'm curious about kind of if you have ventured into this, because this is something that's captivated my thinking a lot lately too in the realm of the church. Are you familiar with the podcast The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill?
I listened to some of that. I did. I didn't know much about Mars Hill before. I just heard the name, over the years. But yeah, I listened to some of it. It's fascinating. I want to finish it.
Yeah, so it's very good. And it almost is ominous to kind of bring it up in this conversation. But one of the things that, and I don't know where you stand on this, but perhaps Theology of Home kind of alludes to this, and this is why I'm asking. But one of the big talking points throughout the rise and fall of Mars Hill is what evangelical churches do to abuse women. Now, while there may be some truth to that, ultimately what's really behind that is that they refuse to adopt a scriptural standpoint of complementarianism. They rather are adopting a view of egalitarianism. Now, the interesting thing there for me, and this is why I kind of want to dovetail it with some of the woke invasion of the church, is that it would be one thing to disagree on a biblical basis for complementarianism and to affirm egalitarianism. But what they actually do throughout the podcast is they demonize complementarianism without the use of scripture from more or less kind of a feminist talking point in culture. And throughout, there's just been this thing going on inside of me that I've just thought to myself, man, this is reminiscent of what we're experiencing in the culture here. The rise and fall of Mars Hill in some ways seems like an indication of what's really going on in the church, because then they'll even go as far as to kind of distance Christianity from the belief in miracles and espouse certain kind of Christian liberalism in different ways throughout the podcast that just kind of get my discernment meter kind of registering. So I'm wondering if you sense that at all in that podcast. I know you haven't listened to a lot of it, but if you sense that at all in that podcast, or if you feel like there is a sense in which the woke movement is mainstream in the church. Because obviously Christianity Today, right? I mean, the name evokes that idea of mainstream Christianity, and certainly I would think they would espouse themselves to be kind of a journalistic endeavor to speak about mainstream Christianity.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I actually, for a long time, I thought about writing a book about the role of men and women from the perspective of a Catholic versus from the perspective of evangelical, because I think they can be really related, but I think I have some senses that they're different, but I haven't studied it in depth, so I hesitate to speak too much. But for example, we're in a very traditional Catholic community. No birth control. We have 6 kids. Most of our friends around here are, 6, 9 kids. Very traditional. But the phrase headship almost never comes up. Whereas I hear that much more associated with evangelicals, and I don't know why that difference is, but I think there's something happening there. And I wonder if, I write in the book about the importance of understanding. For example, man, I think is really called to be an icon of authority. It's in his deeper voice, the broader shoulders, more commanding stature. And I think women are called to be an icon of innocence in the world, and virtue. And that doesn't mean, and nurturing, obviously. And that doesn't mean that men can't be nurturing or women can't have some authority or leadership. It just means that these are different expressions of God's love
but I almost wonder if there are Christians today and pastors who would just balk at that idea, right? That there is this really obvious difference between a man and a woman.
I think there probably are, and there's some ways in which the caricature of, the domineering fundamentalist husband, that has so fulfilled our imaginations that we're constantly kind of fighting that old battle. And I don't know if that's this is an old C.S. Lewis quote, that every generation fights their parents' battle, not the battle they're currently facing. So, for example, where the fire and brimstone preacher might have been more prevalent, in my parents' generation or, different generation. What's our temptation now? Our temptation is to be cowardly, right? So you kind of have to work against your natural inclination. The natural inclination of the age is not to be fire and brimstone or, but rather to be too docile to the culture. So, it's loosely related to, I think, what you're talking about with the complementarianism. But I certainly think that one of the goals of the woke movement is to eliminate utterly any meaningful difference between men and women. And that part of the restoration of the culture is for men to truly remember and reclaim how to be men, and for women to really truly embrace their womanhood. And that cannot be in a shallow sort of just merely role-based way. But I think it's a much deeper idea than that. For example, I think that one of the things I say sometimes in talks is the truly strong man is the holy man. And holiness is, our model is Christ, which is a servant type of leadership. It's not Christ never led through domination, but he was strong. He was utterly manly, but he was a true gentleman. He was a gentle man. So he was manly, but he was also gentle, and I think that there's something powerful in that because it shows a certain self-restraint and self-command. And that it's sort of a weaker man that has to, sort of operate through domination or, these old caricatures. So,
that's right.
I don't know if that answers your question well enough.
I think there's a lot of that goes into just a misunderstanding of what meekness is. That meekness is not weakness. Meekness is controlled strength. That it's almost like the Superman thing, right? Is that you can be Clark Kent when you need to be, and that's who Jesus was. He was the strongest being on the planet and in the universe, but yet had restraint and knew how to be tough when he needed to be tough, knew how to be tender when he needed to be tender. But I really wonder anymore if at least the pastors in the circles that I run in understand that anymore, because strength nowadays is almost immediately perceived as white cisgender hierarchy, and it's just you try to avoid it if at all possible, and we just defer to this weak position instead. So I guess that brings us to the final thing that I wanted to ask you about. And you write about this, and if there's other things that register to you, maybe even as more important, but this is the one that just comes to mind for me. I wonder if some of the cure, beyond just the obvious and from our framework of the gospel, a true revelatory understanding of Jesus Christ, I wonder if a reclamation of honor culture is something that we desperately need to truly fight off the tendencies toward intersectionality, toward grievance, toward resentment, toward victimization. So instead of people having a high place or a place of prominence or priority in culture based upon how victimized they are, a la intersectionality, if we need to try to, as Christians, try to help people reclaim prominence in culture through virtue and through honor, through truth-telling, through honesty, and through courage. I mean, this is one of the things that I think probably is the thing that's captivated me a lot lately. I think this cultural movement has revealed in me my lack of courage, my lack of fighting and speaking up when I know that there is social repercussions. I think Christians are living more and more and more in that space, is that there's social repercussions for what you believe. And of course, we see this all the time too in pop culture Christianity, is that pastors cannot speak about some of the things that the Bible clearly says, or else they're going to lose followers, or else they're going to have the problem Jesus had. People will walk away. And the big church that they've built up over years and years and years is in jeopardy if they really tell the truth. So we have to be careful about that, and maybe too much. But I'm just wondering about what honor culture, how honor culture plays into the remedy for our times.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, actually, in the book, I talk about this study. Some sociologists talk about three different types of culture: honor culture, dignity culture, and victim culture. I would say that honor culture is probably an antidote in some ways more directly to what we're experiencing now in victim culture. But dignity culture is the one that I think is more closely aligned maybe with the Christian call of being, which is that, with honor culture, your name is, your reputation is extremely important, which isn't necessarily bad. Reputation is, people's names should be respected and should not be slandered.
Yeah.
But dignity culture really embodies the Christian understanding that even if you're slandered, even if you're insulted, even if you're hated, that there is some dignity that you have that is not dependent on the opinions of other people around you. It's only found in your being a daughter or son of God. And that's something that's the old saying, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me.
Yeah.
That truly there is a dignity in every person that is inseparable from them. And that might give us a perspective of being able to be, despised in this world, if that's what Christ is calling us to be. Even more, I think, than the focus on the honor culture. The thing that I think is so dangerous about now is that, the victimhood culture, we really have created this society of constant roiling conflict because people are competing. You gain moral stature based on how you've been harmed. And so everyone is kind of competing to be more harmed,
Depression Olympics, it's been called. Yeah.
Yeah, the Depression Olympics. Yeah. So yeah, and the odd thing about this too is that it gives other people so much power over you. So for example, with the transgender movement, if I can speak into reality, in defiance of my bodily reality, I can speak my new identity just through my words. That means that someone else can take it away with their words. And this is why there's so much coercion of using the right pronouns, because everyone else's opinion and everyone else affirming this whole new metaphysical understanding what a human person is can either destroy or sustain your lie. And so it gives people so much power over your reality, even how people talk now about my reality, this type of thing, rather than having a common reality. So I think victim culture is, where we're headed with it is going to lead nowhere good. And there's a lot to be learned from honor culture, but I think I would lean more into dignity culture.
Yeah, that's great. Leave it to the cisgender white Christian male to talk about honor culture rather than dignity culture. But I think both are just absolutely needed in this hour, and I think people could get a whole lot from your book. I think this podcast is an attempt to really try to help Christians respond, to develop a robust Christian worldview, so that they can be the answer that people are looking for in society. And if we just become an echo of the culture, we are not going to be that answer. They can find that wherever they want. But the one thing that people we know are desperately really looking for is a thoughtful Christian response to what's going on in the world, and that has always been in vogue, and it's never not been needed. So for what you've done in your book, and I know it is incredibly hard to write a book I'm presently working on right now, I just want to say thank you for all the work and all the effort that you put in writing Awake Not Woke. So let us know how we can follow you, how we can buy the book, and how we can stay up to date with some of the things that you're writing.
Sure. I have a place for my personal writing, which is just my name, noellemering.com. There's a subscription there. I'm not great at sending out emails through it, but I'm trying to get better at it. Yeah, I also am an editor of theologyofhome.com, and we have a shop there. You can buy our books. And Awake Not Woke is available there or anywhere you buy books, any of the evil big tech companies also as well.
Yeah. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to buy some copies that I can give out to some of the people who are on our subscriber list. So I'll let you guys know know how you can do that at a later point in time. But for now, thank you so much, Noelle, for being on. I look forward to potentially maybe talking with you in the future as you dig into maybe writing some other things, a book on the role of men and women in the church and in the home, and as you continue to do that with theology of home. So thanks so much for being on today.
Thanks so much, Ree. This was great. And you've provided a great forum with a lot of courage, and your voice is important. So thanks so much for doing what you do.
Well, likewise to you. Thank you so much. And bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for watching.
You can catch brand new episodes of Indie Thinker with Reed Huberman every Monday and weekly bonus episodes to keep you thinking throughout the week. But you have to subscribe and click the bell to be notified when new episodes drop. If you enjoy this content, make sure to like this video and share it with friends.